Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. In this podcast, Green Socialist Notes is about continuing to educate and agitate and organize for the eco-socialist program that Angela Walker, my running mate, and I ran on. And today we have a Ukrainian guest, Daria Saburova, who will be talking about the resistance of working class Ukrainians, particularly women, to Russia's invasion. We'll find out what's going on with Ukrainians. But first, I wanted to briefly update us on where I think we are after the Peace in Ukraine Summit in Switzerland last weekend that we talked about on last week's podcast. And the summit certainly got Vladimir Putin's attention because the day before the summit started, he announced again that he was willing to talk peace, but it was more of the same. It was an ultimatum, not a serious peace proposal. Putin said he is ready to talk if Ukraine surrendered the rest of the 4 oblasts or states, regions that Russia claims to have annexed, but does not completely occupy. So he was asking for another 5% of Ukrainian land and people. And he said he would talk if Ukraine demilitarized. That's a goal from the very first days of the full-scale invasion that Putin set out. And demilitarization means disarming Ukraine so it can't defend itself from Russia. And he said, if Ukraine denazifies, which basically means regime change, and Putin gets to put a puppet in charge in Ukraine. And then if those conditions are met, then Putin said he was ready to discuss the terms of surrender, basically. So Putin was posing to the world as a peacemaker, but it was not a serious peace proposal. It was another ultimatum. So when the weekend came, that was on Friday, Saturday and Sunday, 92 countries had representation at the Peace in Ukraine Summit in Switzerland. And at the end of the weekend, 85 countries signed on to a communique, which reaffirmed the 2 United Nations General Assembly resolutions demanding that Russia withdraw from Ukraine. It said that the UN Charter, with its opposition to wars of aggression and support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations, has to be the basis for a just and sustainable peace. And then they laid out 3 peace-building steps, which come from the 10-point Ukrainian peace plan that they would work towards. And that included returning the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant to Ukrainian control under the supervision of the International Atomic Energy Agency. The second point was ending Russia's weaponization of food and undermining of global food security by ending the attacks on Ukrainian farms, food processors, ports, and ships. Those attacks were designed to prevent the export of Ukrainian grains and other agricultural products. And the third point was exchanging all political prisoners of war on both sides and returning all Ukrainian civilians, including thousands of children that have been illegally detained and deported to Russia. So there was, some significant support internationally for some of the points in Ukraine's peace plan coming out of this summit. But it's not clear how many of them or any of them can be implemented without Russian cooperation. So then on Monday, after the summit, Putin went to North Korea, where the 2 countries signed a mutual defense pact in which Russia gets munitions for its war in Ukraine and may get some Korean labor to partially meet its shortage of workers, and North Korea in turn gets food, fossil fuels, and it looks like missile technology for its nuclear weapons program. So Russia is now in violation of a dozen UN Security Council sanctions and monitoring resolutions regarding North Korea's nuclear weapons program that Russia originally adopted. And back in March, they pulled out of the monitoring. They vetoed continuation of monitoring by the UN of North Korea's nuclear weapons program. 85 countries signed a communique, and Putin met with one of the few countries that supports his war. So I think the big picture we can take away is that Ukraine has some support from 85 countries. Russia has support from a few countries like North Korea. The other thing we have to keep in mind is about half of the world's countries are just avoiding taking sides. And the problem for Ukraine in winning the support of those countries, many of them from the post-colonial, or maybe you want to call it neo-colonial global South, that are standing aside, The problem is being made much more difficult by the US continuing to support Israel's genocidal war in Gaza. So the hypocrisy of the US supporting Israel's violations of international law and human rights undermines Ukraine's case, and the US makes it okay, somewhat, for winning support for them under international law and human rights. So, the basic picture probably remains the same. There is little prospect for serious negotiations for a just peace, and the war will continue. The demands of Russia and Ukraine are mutually exclusive. Russia wants Ukraine to surrender, and Ukraine wants the return of the Russian-occupied Ukrainian land and people. So for us, the question is, what side are we on? The Russian aggressors or the Ukrainian defenders? Are we going to be silent and indifferent to Russia's brutal war of aggression? Or are we going to provide moral, political, and material support for Ukraine's self-defense? I think we have to realize we have to be ready for a long struggle against the Russian war in Ukraine, like we, at least my age, had a long struggle, a decade-long struggle, to stop the US war in Vietnam. This is just the way it looks. And I'll just conclude this by, let's put in the chat again, that statement I put. It's from an eco-socialist perspective on this sustained struggle that leftists from Ukraine, Russia, and around the world have endorsed. It's called Ukraine, a people's peace, not an imperial peace. So with that background, let's talk to Daria Saburova, who should appear on the screen. There she is. Hi, Daria.
Hey, Howie. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, Daria is a Ukrainian activist and academic scholar. She grew up in Kyiv, and she now teaches and is a PhD candidate in France. Her work focuses on Marxism and labor studies. She's active in the European Network in solidarity with Ukraine. She's written several articles addressing the Western left on the question of Ukraine, and also on the need for solidarity between Ukrainians and Palestinians. And we'll put those articles in the chat at some point. I don't want to distract people from what Daria is about to present. So the reason I asked Daria to come on is she has a new book out. And I'm not even going to try to say it in French. The English translation, which has problems, maybe Daria will mention it, because French is gendered and English isn't, but Workers of the Resistance to the Ukrainian Working Classes in the Face of War. And we'll put this link in now. It's a link to the book for those of you that can read it, who can read French. And I looked at it. It's not super expensive like a lot of academic books. It's reasonably priced, 17 euros, which is about $18.25 right now. But even if you don't speak French, Daria is here to speak about it in English, and her English is probably more proper than mine. So welcome, Daria. And so your book is based on fieldwork and interviews you did in the industrial city of Kryvyi Rih, mainly with working class women engaged in voluntary activities. They're often Russian speaking and did not support the Maidan revolution, but after the full-scale invasion by Russia in February 2022, they've joined the resistance. So why don't you start by telling us how the idea of the book was born, and why did you choose this social group as the object of your study?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Howie. And again, thank you for having me on this program and for your comprehensive and very intelligent presentation of the situation right now with Ukraine and the negotiating option. So to answer your question, when the full-scale invasion started, I was, as you mentioned, doing a PhD in philosophy, working on a dissertation about the questions of work and labor in Marxism. But I was forced to put this research on hold for some time. Firstly, because my own family and friends came to France as refugees, but also because I started to get involved in Ukraine Solidarity Network. So my book basically starts not from an academic engagement, but from an activist engagement, which extended in my fieldwork through various collaborations that we managed to establish between the voluntary working class organizations that I studied and the solidarity organizations in Switzerland and France that sent some help to those organizations. But there was also another motivation for my study, and that is that starting with 2022, I participated a lot in the debates about Ukraine within the radical left in France. And as you know, because this is also the case in the United States, these debates mostly centered on geopolitical questions. So questions like, what is the NATO's responsibility in the war? Is Russia imperialist or not? If it is imperialist, in what sense? Are we dealing with a national liberation war, or are we dealing with a proxy war between Russia and the West, etc., etc.? So very quickly, these debates became quite repetitive. The positions hardened, and we no longer found ourselves within the same discussion spaces. That is, the pro-Ukrainian left on the one side would, hold its own events, and then the so-called pro-peace activists on the other refused to defend the Ukrainians' right to self-defense and rather advocated for the quickest possible negotiations with Putin. And what I found is that the Ukrainians themselves were largely absent in these debates, and that there was very little talk and interest towards the actual experience of Ukrainians on the ground. But at the same time, in the mainstream press, there was a lot of compassions for Ukrainians at the very beginning of the invasion, unlike Palestinians that were immediately collectively treated as terrorists. So there was this compassion for Ukrainians, and even at some extent romanticization of the Ukrainian resistance, right? But the issues of class and gender relations within the Ukrainian society were not part of the discussion on the side of the mainstream public opinion. So that's basically why I chose to investigate specifically how working class women engage in the resistance through voluntary activities to help fighters, refugees, and people living in war zones, but also territories recently liberated by the Ukrainian army in the Kherson region, because I did my field work in the first 3 months of the year 2023. I also chose a city where support for the resistance was not obvious at first glance. So, as you already mentioned, it is a city called Kryvyi Rih, which is an industrial city in central Ukraine. It is, by the way, the city from where the president Volodymyr Zelensky comes from originally. And this city is very interesting because geographically, but especially economically, socially, and culturally, it is very close to the Donbass. So obviously, I could not go and do my research in the Donbass because part of the Donbass is occupied, and the other part of the Donbass is very dangerous because that is where most of the fighting is going on. So I chose a city that is, by its social profile, very close to the cities like Donetsk or Lugansk. So Donetsk or Lugansk are coal mining cities, and Kryvyi Rih is a iron mining city. So people who live in this city are, as you already said, Russian speaking or speak a mixture of Russian and Ukrainian. Many of them have family in Russia, even though they broke the ties in most of the cases with their family who supports Russian aggression in Ukraine. They also have very positive ties with the Soviet memory. And politically, before 2014, they supported Yanukovych and supported his pro-Russian party of regions. And up to today, they still consider Maidan as a mistake, and they criticize the post-Maidan government, right? In 2019, they massively voted for Volodymyr Zelensky, who presented himself as a non-nationalist and a pro-negotiations candidate regarding, I mean, the war in the Donbass, which was already happening at the time. So it was even more interesting to see why this social group joined the resistance. You know, why at the time of my fieldwork they no longer defended a pro-Russian position or even a pro-negotiation position. And so concentrating on this precise field in Ukraine helps to dismantle many pre-established ideas that exist in the radical left in France, but also elsewhere regarding the Ukrainian working classes.
Why did they decide to resist? What are their motivations? And then what kind of activities and organizations have they established to, in their resistance?
So yeah, so basically what we see when we concentrate on this particular social group is that the Ukrainian resistance is not only composed of what we call like Ukrainian nationalists, or it's not only composed of the pro-European, pro-Maidan middle classes and upper classes, right? So there are actually a lot of people in the Ukrainian resistance that don't fit into that typical portrait that maybe people have of Ukrainian of the Ukrainian resistance. The working class women that I talked to, they didn't join the resistance because of the need to defend the European values or even defend Ukrainian borders as a symbol of national sovereignty. So it's not for them a question of defending any type of nationalist or liberal pro-European Ukrainian state. They mobilized in the resistance because their city was heavily bombed from the very first day of the war and threatened with occupation. The Russian army was only 15 kilometers away from Kryvyi Rih in the first days of the war. So basically, the choice that these women were facing at the time was the choice between military occupation, exile, and resistance. So that is the choice that Ukrainian working classes live with directly. And faced with these options, many choose to resist here and now because organizing under a Russian military occupation to resist is much more complicated and dangerous. And on the other hand, exile is a very hard experience, which is for some people an experience of a complete collapse of their world that they're used to and all the social ties that they have in their life and that help them survive materially and psychologically on the daily basis. So that's why basically the working classes participated quite naturally in the resistance from the very beginning. I mean, of course, the working classes participate in state resistance structures, so notably the army, but also private ones managed by middle and upper classes, such as big humanitarian NGOs. But what is interesting in Kryvyi Rih, at least in my field, what was interesting is that I discovered that many of them also formed their autonomous working class structures at the local community level. So I studied two organizations. So one of them was specialized in logistics. They received humanitarian aid from other bigger organizations, and then formed individual packages of humanitarian aid and that brought them either to the fighters in the east or to refugees and vulnerable populations in the deoccupied territories. And there was another organization, a local organization, mostly run by pensioners, female pensioners, who before either worked in the industrial sector or in the public sector. And their organization was specialized in collecting aid for refugees and distributing it, but also organizing collective kitchens to prepare homemade meals for the fighters in the east once again. And what is interesting about these working class organizations that they are mostly led by women, so which is in contrast with a lot of middle and upper class NGOs which are managed by men. There's also no kind of hierarchy between the manager and people who volunteer for the organization. So they are very horizontally organized, and everybody decides collectively. Like they talk about what their objectives are, and then they decide on collective meetings. What is also interesting is that these people did not volunteer in the wake of the Maidan uprising. As I already said, a lot of them were against the Maidan, so they didn't participate in this big wave of volunteer movement that already came out of the Maidan uprising. But their volunteering has a tradition. It's just a different tradition. So on the one hand, it is simply the tradition of local community mutual aid that helped a lot of working class families survive, especially in the 90s in Ukraine, where the privatization processes were very harsh, and people had to rely on their community and mutual aid to survive, but also class solidarity during workers' strikes. So the specificity of the workers' strike in the mines in Kryvyi Rih, which are like mines that are sometimes as deep as 1,000 kilometers down the ground, is that basically the only way to strike, the only efficient way to strike, is for the workers to stay in the mines after their shift, right? So each time there's a strike in the mines in Kryvyi Rih, workers stay days and weeks and sometimes up to a month and more under the ground, and these are mostly men, right, who work in the mines. And women in these conditions, they have this habit of organizing on the surface. So they organize on the surface to provide the strikers with all the necessary food, hygiene products, etc. And they also carry the demands of the strikers into the public sphere. So they demonstrate in the city, calling for higher salaries and better working conditions. So women have this experience in self-organization, and it is this experience of self-organization that helps them today to organize in the face of Russian invasion.
So I wonder if there are any, stories or narratives from people you interviewed that would give us some idea of their thinking as they ended up, supporting the resistance to Russia's invasion after having been supportive of the pro-Russian Party of Regions. And also, what do you think that might mean for when normal politics returns to Ukraine?
Yeah, well, so basically what they're saying is that before the Maidan, why did they support Yanukovych is not exactly because they supported wholeheartedly the oligarchic capitalist regime that was predominant in Ukraine at the time. But like, one has to admit that this paternalist oligarchic capitalist model was quite protective of specific categories of workers, and industrial workers in the Donbass, and also industrial workers in Kryvyi Rih, whose mines and whose enterprises belonged to Rinat Akhmetov, who was, one of the biggest oligarchs funding the Party of Regions. That is why these workers, in particularly, were much better protective than other categories of workers, for example, the informal workers or the migrant workers that were more interested in Ukrainian integration with the European Union, because they do this regular travels to the EU to look for work, right? So this kind of the capitalist model offered by the Ukrainian oligarchs of the industrial enterprises offered some advantages, like additional social protection, additional primes for these workers, etc., etc. So Ukraine was also, on the national level, quite protected from what Naomi Klein calls the
shock doctrine.
Yeah, the shock therapy. Yes, exactly. I'm sorry. So the dismantlement of the social state in Ukraine was going on much slower than it did in some countries like Russia or Poland. And basically, so what the Maidan brought with it is a new model of capitalism, which is a neoliberal, pro-European kind of capitalism. So it is a capitalism that is maybe more transparent. It is maybe more, less corrupt from a certain point of view. But at the same time, it is a capitalism that is driven by permanent austerity measures that dismantles the social state. And basically, this is what the people I interviewed criticized the post Maidan government for, is that they continued to introduce a lot of neoliberal policies, and this is so basically what we can hope for Ukraine after the war is that this part of resistance is not going to be silenced, and that the workers will continue to oppose this new national liberal paradigma which is dominant in Ukraine, and that that post-war Ukraine can still be multilingual, can still be socially orientated, etc. But of course, it surely does need to have strong labor organizations and strong left organizations, feminist organizations that are going to advance this kind of agenda. Oh, I can't hear you, Howie. Sorry.
Yeah, I've been muted, so Daria doesn't hear an echo when she speaks. I'm curious. You're in France, and what do you make of the position taken by this new popular front of socialist, communists, Greens, and Mélenchon's, I probably pronounced that wrong, France Unbowed, the support for military aid that is in their common platform is a change for the communists in France Unbowed, as I understand it. Have they really changed their mind, or is it a temporary concession to keep the coalition together? How do you think that's going to play out?
Yeah, so I mean, since February 2022, the French Communist Party and France Unbowed have condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And after initial reactions, for example, Mélenchon posted a tweet on the 25th of February calling for immediate negotiations rather than arm deliveries. But then afterwards, seeing that the public opinion was actually very supportive of Ukrainian resistance, both political formations actually resigned themselves to support armed deliveries. So that is not something new. I would say that the problem with the French Communist Party and the French Unbowed is that at the same time they systematically sought to undermine new deliveries, which means that every time that each new aid package was decided or a decision was made regarding a new type of weaponry sent or a new type of use of this weaponry. So the latest debate concerned whether the Ukrainian forces can use the Western weapons to hit targets inside the Russian territories from where bombs are being sent to shell Ukrainian cities. So every time there's this new aid package, France Unbowed denounces the escalation on the Western side. So it's not like so they don't have this this very direct anti-Ukrainian position. It's kind of more nuanced, but at the same time, objectively, it does serve the opposite side. In the months that led up to the European elections, the rhetoric of both of these left parties was kind of openly unsupportive of Ukraine. So both parties opposed Ukraine's entry into the European Union based on nationalistic arguments, opposing the interests of the French worker and the interests of the Ukrainian worker. And they also advocated peace against war, claiming that Ukraine could achieve peace through immediate negotiations. For example, along the way, Mélenchon questioned Ukraine's territorial integrity by proposing to organize a conference on borders, right? And as you've already mentioned in your presentation, we know what that discussion about borders means for Putin. It means that Ukraine must give up more and more territories under military threat. So fortunately, all of this is absent from the common program resulting from the alliance that forms the New Popular Front. And it is also worth mentioning that this front also includes the new anti-capitalist party, which from the very beginning supported the Ukrainian resistance, and that presents one of its candidates, Philippe Poutou, for the elections. Obviously, one can regret that this alliance pulls kind of the economic and the social program of the Unbowed France kind of more to the right. But at the same time, like in a less radical direction, at least. But at the same time, I would say that concerning the international policies, the compromise is actually quite positive, because at the same time, it pulls the Communist Party and France Unbowed towards a more pro-Ukrainian position. And at the same time, it pulls the Socialist Party in a more pro-Palestinian direction. So, for example, concerning Ukraine, this common program affirms the need to defend Ukraine, its freedom, its internationally recognized borders, including through necessary arms deliveries. It also advocates for the annulation of the Ukrainian external debt. And considering Palestine, it characterizes without any nuance that what's happening in Gaza is genocide. It supports arms embargo on Israel and recognizes the state of Palestine, at least as a step towards broader decolonization of Palestine. So hopefully, at least I do hope, that this coalition wins against the far right in the upcoming parliamentary elections, and that it holds together after these elections. Of course, the victory of the French far right, of Le Pen's party, with its historical ties to Putin and other reactionary regimes, would not only be a big tragedy for the French working people, especially of people of color in France, but it would also be the worst thing that could happen to Ukraine in the situation. But also, the whole historical sequence that led to these anticipated elections also shows that Macron's liberal authoritarian right is not a reliable supporter for Ukraine. We can see that Macron is much more ready to deliver the country to the far right than he is ready to accept that that the left at some point can come to power. So in the current situation, I would say that the New Popular Front is the most natural ally of the Ukrainian resistance, as well as of the Palestinian struggle against occupation and for just and lasting peace. And Ukrainian solidarity initiatives in France fully support the New Popular Front.
Yeah, I urge people to follow this election. It's June 30th, and they have runoffs if nobody gets a majority in the first round. So it's not instant runoff voting, what we call ranked choice voting. It's just a runoff, like they do in some of the southern states. And that runoff would be a week later on July 7th. And I think what the New Popular Front of this coalition of leftist groups, it's a lot we can learn in the American left. They got together and they were serious, and they worked together and they made compromises and came up with a common program. We don't have that. And in fact, we don't have parties that have members and are democratically structured. We have what we call the nonprofit industrial complex, where actually the progressive nonprofits are funded by millionaires and billionaires. And movement actions like these marches and conferences organized from the top down. It's very different today from during the anti-Vietnam War movement. Everybody get together and we'd have these raucous conferences hammering out what the demands would be and what the action would be. Now you get it over the internet from the top down. So I would just urge people to follow the news as much as you can in France and study what the left there has done, because there's a lot of lessons for us. And maybe in the future we could have a podcast just on that kind of organizing issue that I just identified. But we get a lot of questions, but let me just wrap up, give you the chance, Daria, to talk about what do the Ukrainian people, and particularly the Ukrainian left, ask of the Western left in solidarity?
Yeah, so I don't think it can be repeated enough, but contrary to the positions unfortunately taken by much of the left, especially the radical left in the West, is that the demand to support the armed resistance of the Ukrainian people, and consequently the demand to support weapon deliveries against the Russian aggression, is a broadly consensual position among the Ukrainian population. And this independently of the fact that our population is more and more polarized against this question of whether to start negotiations or not, and whether we are ready to seize some territories in order to have a ceasefire. The question of armed deliveries is disconnected from that discussion, because Ukraine obviously cannot continue to to have at least some kind of defense guarantees if it is unarmed, facing the Russian army and the Putin's regime. And this demand is also supported by the leftist organizations, socialist organizations, anarchist, feminist, queer, and LGBT movements, student movement, etc. So this is quite in contrast of what was going on during the Donbass war, because I have the impression that between 2014 and 2022, part of the Ukrainian left, as well as of working classes, especially in eastern and southern Ukraine, were still hesitant about the strategy to adopt in response to the annexation of Crimea and the Russian intervention in the Donbass. Many did support the Minsk agreements as a lesser evil to save human lives, and that is why the Ukrainian population actually chose massively, especially the working classes, chose Zelensky over Poroshenko in 2019, because he had this negotiation plan for Ukraine. But after February 24th, 2022, the situation changed, because it became clear that Putin's regime does not respect any agreements and will not stop in its desire to politically subdue Ukraine until it is stopped. So for Putin, it is simply unacceptable that Ukraine escapes his sphere of influence. And given the rapid fascization of the Putin regime the last 2 years, with relying on military expansion for its existence, there's actually little hope that if and when the ceasefire occurs, that it will resolve the issue of peace in Ukraine. And it is easy to see that Putin's problem with Ukraine is not whether it joins NATO or not, because there are at least two good counterexamples. The first one being Finland. Finland, while Ukraine was only expressing its will to join NATO, Finland actually joined NATO, and it has a common border with Russia. And Russia did not invade Finland to prevent this from happening. And then there's another counterexample, which is Putin sending his troops to Kazakhstan in January 2022, just before the invasion of Ukraine, to suppress a popular uprising in this country, which was a popular uprising against rising gas prices, against rising poverty. These protests had nothing to do with the Kazakhs wanting to join the European Union or NATO, but just like the Maidan uprising, they did threaten a local regime loyal to the Kremlin. So Putin's objective in Ukraine is clearly not just Ukrainian neutrality; it is Ukrainian loyalty to Russia, including taking part in the military collective security treaty organization, which was what Putin wanted from Yanukovych when the Maidan uprising started. But I just want to say that supporting arms deliveries does not prevent us from having discussions about the best time for Ukraine to enter into negotiations with Russia. So we know very, very well that Ukrainians are exhausted, that they have suffered many damages and losses, and that today Ukrainian army is struggling to recruit new soldiers. A lot of men are hiding from the army officers that are searching to mobilize. This does not mean that that it is the delivery of Western weapons that prolonges the war. It is Putin's army and Putin that waits for allies to abandon Ukraine, and a disarmed Ukraine would unfortunately be an easy prey for new attacks. So, independently of ceasefire or not, this is something that is asked by all the Ukrainians. However, armed deliveries are today far from being acts of solidarity, so they are not gifts, they are loans. That is why supporting the cancellation of Ukrainians' external debt is a second major demand of the Ukrainian population and the Ukrainian left in particular. So the working classes should not be made to pay for this war, especially through neoliberal reforms that are, intended to make economies in order to pay back the states that gave us weapons. Because neoliberal reforms attack deeply the living and working conditions of ordinary people. And then, of course, solidarity must involve direct links with local organizations. That means direct links with leftist parties, with volunteers, with unions. So being in solidarity with Ukraine is listening to the Ukrainians on the ground. Obviously, Ukrainians are very diverse. Maybe you will meet Ukrainians that are very engaged in resistance, that are struggling with their arms. Maybe you will find Ukrainians that desert the army, that don't want to serve in the army anymore. But the thing is, you have to talk to all of this diversity instead of closing up on dogmas and having discussions in closed circles that never get interested in what's going on the ground. So support social struggles in Ukraine, support workers, Ukrainian workers against Ukrainian capitalists, support Ukrainian feminists and Ukrainian LGBT organizations against far-right forces, support populations that express, that express the will to to have a multilingual, multicultural Ukraine rather than the monolinguistic norm that is promoted by the Ukrainian states. So all of the things are general things that people can do to support Ukraine.
Okay, Daria, thank you for that. We've got questions in the chat. I would just say what I heard you saying is, support the Ukrainian state and military struggle against the Russian invasion, but give your political support to the progressive movements within Ukraine. And that's something I learned during the anti-Vietnam War movement. A guy named, he wrote a pamphlet called The ABCs of National Liberation Struggles. And he said we had to make that distinction between, his name was Hal Draper. And it was an influential pamphlet in the anti-war movement. So, our message was U.S. troops out of Vietnam, out now. That became a slogan because we had no business invading Vietnam. And political support, people had different politics. It didn't mean we had to support the NLF or the North Vietnamese army, or the Buddhists or whatever factions. That was their business. So, but, progressive forces, they are in Ukraine. I think Daria just mentioned some of them: trade unions, socialist groups, the anarchist collectives that are doing solidarity work, feminist groups, environmentalists. We've had Svetlana Romanko on here talking about the need to strengthen fossil fuel sanctions on Russia and reconstruct Ukraine around renewable energy. So, you don't have to pick sides between the NATO neoliberal EU camp and the Russian imperialist camp. You can take an independent path and work with the people. And that's, I think, the most important thing I heard. Instead of listening to other people without the Ukrainians being in the conversation, listen to the Ukrainians. So let's get to some of those questions for Daria. Okay, Frankie Lee. I don't agree that Russia invaded Ukraine. I think they sent in a peacekeeping force to stop native Russian Ukrainians from being slaughtered by a band of right Nazis. But I respect other opinions. Well, you just did your field work with the people that she's presumably talking about. So what's your response?
I think the person that's asking this question just didn't listen to the whole conversation that we had before. So I'm not even reacting to this. Howie, sorry, we can't hear you again because you didn't unmute yourself. Sorry.
Yeah, Daria, and this is from Scout Trooper 164. How do you feel that the EU finally allowed accession negotiations with Ukraine? Also, why do people act like Ukraine didn't exist before 1918 when Kiev was founded in 432 before the Christian era?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's also a lot of maybe in order to understand what this question of Ukraine EU accession, I think we have to take in account various factors, because of course I remember that when the Maidan started in November 2013, in late November 2013, it started around the question of the Ukraine signing or not the liberalization of the market exchange between Ukraine and the EU. And at that point, I was, just like the rest of the Ukrainian left, completely opposed to this liberal trade treaty, which up to now, up to today, is completely disadvantageous for Ukraine, and just contributes to to basically flood Ukraine with foreign sometimes, I'm sorry, I forget English words sometimes, foreign products, and also to liberalize the Ukrainian labor market. But with the EU accession, it's a little bit different. So basically, some might see it as the political side of this disadvantageous and like liberal capitalist trade treaty that we already have in Ukraine today. So if today Ukraine has this subordinate position in this relation to EU, the EU accession might with this EU accession, Ukraine might gain at least some more equality regarding to other European countries. Also, I think, and this is what a lot of people in Ukraine think, especially leftist people, feminist and LGBT activists, Ukrainian journalists, is that today, obviously, because of the war going on, and the state of war, and also this the nationalist rhetoric being more and more present in the public sphere in Ukraine. If the EU norms weren't there in terms of the respect of the human rights, for example, then it would be much harder for Ukrainian journalists to continue to do their job, for Ukrainian organizations for human rights, but also for progressive activists. So from this point of view, the EU accession can actually be a kind of a barrier within Ukraine itself to descend precisely into nationalism, to descend into authoritarianism, etc., etc. So for the moment, the Ukraine is a kind of like a military democracy, which is holding, but it is including holding because there is this external point of view on the internal Ukrainian politics. So it can, the obviously we know that and as as an anti-capitalist in France, I know very well how the EU institutions participate in suppressing alternatives within the EU, and more progressive alternatives within the EU. But in the Ukrainian case, I think that this integration can rather play a positive role, at least relatively. Like, we're not talking about Ukraine becoming a socialist, socialist republic, like, or anything like that, or a communist society, but relatively it can help in the current situation. And I think that this is something important to be mentioned. And about why do people act like Ukraine didn't exist before in 1918? I mean, I'm not a historian, but obviously when we're talking about, I mean, I think that what people are talking about is Ukraine as an independent state, and it's true that if we don't count the whole the Cossack experience in the 17th century, then Ukraine first gained independence for a short period after the revolution, after the socialist revolution in Russia, in the Russian Empire. But of course, Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture exist as something original, for a very long time, and the Ukrainian language, in particular, and Ukrainian literature, was formalized in the 19th century. Howie, micro.
The Ukrainian community in my town, Syracuse, New York, has a statue to Taras Shevchenko, who was a sort of a polymath, I think the right word. He was an artist, he was a writer, a poet, and he started writing in the Ukrainian language, had a lot to do with that. So, and you go back to Voltaire complaining in his first book, I think it was 1703, that, Ukraine is oppressed. They're caught between the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but, Ukraine was there. Everybody knew about it. So, next question. Frankie Lee, Daria, do you think Zelensky should call for a presidential election since his term has expired? What are your thoughts?
Listen, I maybe don't have a very definite opinion on this topic. I know that the year that the year before the presumable election, most of Ukrainians were against against presidential elections while the war is continuing for several reasons. And one of those reasons is that because of the Russian occupation, a lot of people cannot vote. A lot of Ukrainians cannot vote in this election, which is very problematic. But also, obviously, because a certain political stability in the country is certainly necessary for the war effort. But at the same time, if the war will continue, if we're, because I think that people oppose this election because at least after the first year of the war, people were quite enthusiastic and believed that the war will end soon. I think that now we're kind of understanding that the war might still last for at least a few years. And in that case, I would say that the organization of a presidential election might be necessary. And at the same time, I actually don't see Zelensky taking that step because Zelensky does like power. So these are my thoughts on the question, I would say.
To an end, what will be your first priority to fix in Ukraine? Did you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that I mean, the social sphere is a big priority, which is reconstruction of housing, creating social housing, reconstruction of infrastructures, going back on all the neoliberal laws that were taken during, that were adopted during the war. So yeah, for me, that would be the priority. Would be putting people and working class people and their interests as a priority in the reconstruction process. Unfortunately, what we see today is that the reconstruction plan that Ukraine presented in many reconstruction conferences abroad is precisely the opposite, which is more liberalization of the labor market, more opening Ukraine to foreign investment, continuing to develop the agricultural sector and basically, transforming Ukraine into an economy that only gives like raw materials without qualified labor sectors. So yeah. The tendency is not very positive in this sense.
Okay, we're out of time, and I really want to thank Daria for being here and in presenting, what people in Kryvyi Rih, they were not with, the politics of the Zelensky government, but when Russia invaded, they joined the resistance. And I hope your book gets translated into English. I'd love to read it in detail, and I think other people would too. So
I hope so too. So if there are any editors listening to us, we would be glad if you come into contact with us.
Stay on after we formally close, because I have some thoughts on that, or some ideas. So, I think, I guess what we'll wrap up with, I'll just tell you what we're going to have next week. We're going to go back and talk to people from Georgia about democracy and sovereignty in that country, which is in crisis, the parallels to Ukraine, and actually the links are obvious. Russia occupies 20% of Georgia. It's intervening in its internal politics. And in response to that, there have been massive protests, like during the Maidan revolution. 10%, upwards of 10% of the population has been out on the street at one time. It's like 300,000 people in the country, at 3 million. And they're protesting this repressive Russian-style foreign agents law, which requires nonprofits to report their funding. But they already do report their funding. This will basically call them foreign agents and lay the groundwork for repression like it has in Russia. So this time we'll have two Greens from Georgia. And I'm probably going to say the names wrong, but Nato Kirvalidze, who was a Green Party leader in the 1990s and still heads a big environmental NGO that's under threat now from this foreign agents law, and a younger Green, Guram Nikolishvili, who is a young leader. He's a youth Green in the new Green Party in Georgia that emphasizes socially progressive, culturally progressive, anti-patriarchal, anti-homophobic norms in Georgia, as well as the traditional Green concerns with democracy and environment. So we'll get some history on, the Green Party in Ukraine, which has had its ups and downs. which really nobody's written up. I just know a little bit about it. And we'll also talk about how the Greens are relating to the election they will have in October in Georgia, which is going to be a referendum on this new law. But the question is, will it be a fair election? Will the Greens get registered? Will they run candidates? Will they support another opposition candidate? So I don't know much about these things, but we'll get the word firsthand from these two Greens in Georgia. So that's next week. And thanks again, Daria, for being here. And I think people got a lot out of it. Thanks.
Thank you so much.